Welcome to the Commonwealth Club of California for the latest in our series of Lavender Talks, co-presented by San Francisco Pride. Today's program is made possible by the generous support of Gilead Pride Alliance and Comcast. We also thank San Francisco Pride's legacy sponsors. I'm John Zipper, the club's Vice President of Media and Editorial. We hope you are staying safe and well wherever you are, and we look forward to seeing you in person again when the world returns to something like normal, back here at the Commonwealth Club's headquarters in San Francisco. Until that happens, we are doing all of our programming online. This is the latest in more than 200 online programs the club has produced just in the past 5 months. You can find all of our upcoming programs, as well as audio and video of our past programs and how you can help support our program production at commonwealthclub.org. If you are watching us live on YouTube or Facebook, you can use the chat function to post questions to our panelists, and we'll work some of those into our conversation here today. Now I'd like to introduce Michelle Miao. She's a member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors, the former president of San Francisco Pride, and the longtime producer and host of The Michelle Miao Show. Good to see you again, Michelle.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to the Commonwealth Club and San Francisco Pride for putting this program together, and thank you all for joining us. And like John said, if you're joining us live, we want you engaged in the conversation, so send us questions or comments and we'll get them to our incredible panelists. And now, I'm super excited to introduce you to our great panelists here today. We have Africa America, who's a social justice activist, and San Francisco's Divalicious drag performer. We have Eric Panyavong, who's the hospitality events manager and a Bay Area native, Andrea Shorter, who's commissioner of the Commission on the Status of Women, also co-founder and Castro for All, Bayard Rustin LGBT Coalition, a political strategist and a columnist for SF Bay Times. And finally, last but not least, Stephen Torres, who's the interim secretary for the Castro LGBTQ Cultural District, also a freelance writer and a trusty bartender at Twin Peaks Tavern. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the program.
Hello.
So let's begin.
Hi.
Hello. I feel like we can put up jazz hands since it's a special Pride program. Let's begin with the history of the Castro and share what we know about, how the Castro formed. It seemed to have formed its gay identity in the late 60s during the Summer of Love, as working class families left the Castro for the suburbs. The gays and lesbians, or maybe primarily from what I know, the gays moved into the Castro because of affordable housing. And get this, from some of my reading, I don't know if it's true, but I think it is, you could get a piece of property back then for $20,000 to $40,000. That's not the case nowadays. Yeah, I know. But the Castro then became a social ground for the LGBTQ community, a community with political activism, and it meant so much more, and would grow to be a safe haven, a sanctuary for LGBTQ people around the world. So what's your take on the history of the Castro and what it means to the LGBTQ community? Let's start with Andrea.
Well, first of all, thank you, Michelle, and thank you to the Commonwealth Club for bringing us all together today. Hey, you know what? When you start talking about the Castro, it's always hard to determine where to start, and there is no end, right? But yes, you're right. That is pretty much a really good summation of the history of the Castro, what became known as the Castro. Yes, as people were moving out of the what we now refer to as the Castro used to be a predominantly sort of Irish community, families, single home families, et cetera. As people were doing really, to some degree, a little bit of white flight out of the city and into the suburbs, or even to other parts of San Francisco, maybe out into the Sunset, et cetera. Then as these guys, a number of them that were former military, right? They had just been relieved from the Navy. Naval services started to establish this community, which we now refer to as the Castro. And if you know a little bit of some of the grander icons of LGBTQ liberation movement, certainly Harvey Milk, I think, comes to mind when people think of the Castro. And so I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about, dabble into some of his history But that's a good summation. But certainly over the years, it has become or struggled to become a more diverse community. So we can see the community, we can see Castro as really an iconic place, right? It's sort of ground zero of LGBTQ movement. But it's a neighborhood, it's a commercial strip, it's a community, it's a number of things it's different things to different people. But yes, that's a good summation of its history.
Stephen, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts about the Castro history. I mean, you work for the iconic Twin Peaks Tavern, and the bar itself is history.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good summation, I would say. Something I would add is that it was Irish, predominantly Irish Scandinavian neighborhood, very heavily Catholic, so much so that the church, Most Holy Redeemer, sometimes was shorthand for that neighborhood. And there was a lot of SFPD that lived there. So this all was definitely ripe for early friction between people moving in and people that were already there or on their way out. And Twin Peaks opened in 1972. So right as this was happening, there was only a couple of other bars open at the time. Most of the other bars in the neighborhood were Irish bars. So there's actually, I think it's on KQED, there's a short film that a queer Chicano made that has a clip from one of the owners, the original owners, Mary Ellen, I believe. And she's just talking about everyone's welcome, like just trying to make it like as easy as possible for the existing neighbors to accept them being there. So yeah, a lot of the protocol in that bar in the early days was because they really wanted to try and make it last, and so it was a no touch bar. Like you couldn't kiss, you couldn't hold hands. A lot of the clientele that they tried to attract was professional, working professionals. They wanted to, two women that opened the bar had been in the business for a long time, and so they wanted to really dispense with the dark hidden bar that the gay bar had become synonymous with, and also all those bars on that street at the time had become synonymous with that bar. Before they bought it, the windows were completely blacked out, and that was even when it was an Irish bar, because the whole connotation was that it was a place that you didn't go into. So
Right. Oh, speaking of not being able to touch, and I think, that policy evolves and becomes even a racist act, and we'll get into it very shortly here. But Africa, would love to also hear from you, your recollection or knowledge of Castro history.
Well, I'm a native San Franciscan, so I was born, raised here, and as a little gay boy, I didn't know I was gay at the time. Wait a minute, how did I not know? I mean, hello, look at all this. But I used to actually sing in the San Francisco San Francisco boys chorus when I was a child. And we used to rehearse at Calvary Presbyterian. So I would take the K or the L or the M and get off at Castro Street and stand on the corner in front of Double Rainbow ice cream and in front of Twin Peaks and be terrified and tantalized at the same time, watching the men go up and down the street in their little white t-shirts and their very tight 501 jeans. And I was like, oh my God, scandal, but ooh, scandal. And I used to take the 24 Divisadero to Calvary Pres, and I remember the Castro being, in the beginning, like you guys all have said, it was an Irish Catholic neighborhood, very, very, very Irish Catholic. You'd see the odd Asian or the odd Black person in the neighborhood, but for the most part, mostly Irish Catholic. And then as the gays moved in, and mostly white gays moved in to the Castro, because if you were Black and gay, you were still living like in the Haight or maybe in the Western Addition, and you were very closeted because you were dealing with other things like church and things like that. So the white gays moved into the Castro, and you know, it like I said, tantalizing and terrifying at the same time. And yeah, that's what I remember as a child.
Eric, you're also a San Francisco Bay Area native. What do you know
Yeah.
or remember of Castro history?
Yeah, so growing up, my mother used to always hang out in the Castro with her queer friends. So when my senior year in high school, she snuck me into a bar with her. And during college, I would hang out in the Castro all the time. I went to school at Berkeley, but I came out to the Castro. I remember it being much more diverse than it is now. Over the last couple years, I was managing Fitness SF right there on Noe and Market for 3-4 years, and I lived right behind there. So I've seen the neighborhood change a lot, and I find it because it's become with the social media, with it's become more of a cultural landmark. Whereas back then it was a neighborhood, more of just a neighborhood where people kind of congregated, hung out, and built community. Now, I think there's more of a national and international spotlight on it from, the movie Milk and other things that have put Castro on the map. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. So this next question is for all of you or for anyone who wants to jump in and begin this conversation, and we'll touch on the Castro's racist history. I want to bring up Rodney Barnett, who founded the Compton's Black Panther chapter and who opened, I think, or at least one of the first people to have opened the first Black-owned gay bar in San Francisco, the Eagle Creek. So not sure if any of you know of the Eagle Creek. But, when Rodney moved to San Francisco in 1969, he was surprised, and he described the environment as he was surprised to find that racism in the gay scene was much more pronounced than in the city overall. And he talks about, the rendezvous used to cut music when Black people started to dance, citing a rule against bodily contact. The Stud removed Black music from the jukebox. The Mine Shaft, like other gay bars, Black people are often asked for various different forms of ID. And we know that we can talk about, the history of this practice of other bars that stuck around, such as, the Badlands. And but here's his quote: "The bigger the community got, the worse the discrimination was. I started avoiding even driving through the Castro." So let's open that up, leaving you with that quote and having an open discussion about this. And so I'll toss it to the panelists. Who wants to jump in first?
I'll go. That usually, I'm like, okay, here we go. Let's go roller coaster. So he's right. I mean, I'm a person of a certain age, so I'm gonna just say timeless. But I remember in the 80s when the Pendulum was our Black bar in the Castro, and the Pendulum was the bomb because everybody knew that you went to Daddy's because that was the leather bar in the Castro. You went to Twin Peaks because that's where the older gays go. You went to Mike's Night Gallery across the street, which no longer exists because that's where the naughty people went, and you went to the Pendulum because that's where the Black people were. And because that's the only place that the Black people felt comfortable and safe. And even and to talk about the racism, we also need to talk about the intersectionality and the sexism. I mean, women would come to the Castro and be like, "What are you doing here?" And these are the lesbians. We're not even talking about the straight women. These are the lesbians. Like, "What are you doing here? You have your club over on go to the Lexington Club." So drag performers. Drag wasn't big in the Castro at that time. People think, "Oh, Castro drag." Like, no, drag was not in the Castro. Drag was either on Polk or south of Market. Drag was not the Castro. Drag now, it has gotten into the Castro, but at that time, nope. And Pendulum, so we didn't have drag. We didn't have people of color. We had cisgender white men, old and young, except at the Pendulum.
Yeah, I used to hang out when I first came out. or started going to the Castro, the bar of choice was the Pendulum, because the music was amazing. People went there to dance. I saw people who looked like me. And I think over the years, I've seen the color of the Castro change. It's becoming more predominantly white and Asian. And at bars, at Badlands, at other bars now, I see, acts of microaggressions. And I often see like other gay Asians align themselves with white, gay men. I think as the city's Black and brown population shrinks, I think it's really important for everyone to speak up and to talk about it in our space. And that's something that I think people don't want to admit to in the Castro. And I think it's very real.
Yeah, it's very real. There's it's very real. There are also, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's definitely real. It's been a part of the history. And I think that, again, it goes back to some degree in terms of what people expect of the Castro, right? And as Africa was saying, there has been a time, and it's not gone away entirely, where the idea of the Castro is really a gay white man's playground.
Mm-hmm.
We just have to be very honest and direct about that. That is sort of an idealized version of the Castro. So everyone else then, therefore, is either background or some ancillary characters, or therefore questionable and suspect reason. They're not involved in the majority of the decisions about what the Castro means and who is welcome and who is not welcome. And so it's been certainly a struggle for the community. At one point, several years ago, I was on another panel with the museum, and the discussion was, do we even need the Castro anymore? Mm-hmm. As LGBT issues in our lives become more integrated and more mainstream, we're not there yet. So I just want to be really clear on the panel. I was the one. We ain't there yet. Back then, and we certainly there have been some changes since then. But nonetheless, that is really how the Castro is understood. That is really a utopic, a playground, primarily for the fantasy and idea of gay white men. And if you don't fit a particular mode, if you go back and even looking back to some of the things that Eric was saying, and Africa was saying, it's like going there and seeing these guys in the white T-shirts and the very tight 501c3. That has been the iconic sort of uniform, so to speak, of everyone looking a particular way. And if you didn't fit that mold, then you were definitely out of place and perhaps by some not welcome. One of the things that we were engaged in, I was engaged in, if you all recall, in the mid, around 2004 into 2005, was what became known as the Is Badlands Bad campaign. And part of with John Newsom, Lisa Williams, Lauren Shine, whole host the late, great Julius Turman, who went on to serve on the Police Commission, working with SCIU and others, we boycotted Badlands because of the kinds of practices in terms of, again, these weren't new practices. They weren't new, right? The 3 pieces of ID or looking a certain way. And it was very clear and very evident that it was to, it was segregation. That Black folks, Black men, Latin folks, were not welcome if you didn't fit a particular type of mode or image, or basically just weren't welcome at all. So we challenged that, and it became not only a local movement, but it became a movement that received international attention. So people knew that if you were coming to the Castro, that this boycott was going on, and we were defining what it was about. Are we or are we not going to be an inclusive and welcoming community? And so there's a lot of history there. You can go to AnnCastroForAll.org. You can see the history and also some of the recommendations. We actually had to involve the Human Rights Commission for San Francisco, and it did render that, yes, there was clear discrimination going on at the bar, and had recommendations. And I think that still to this day, there have been efforts to implement those recommendations, but certainly there's still some challenges in terms of how to really create and build and support and sustain an inclusive community.
Stephen, anything to add?
Yeah, I just to build on what everyone else said, I think that it was a very exclusive only to cis white men, and it was built upon the clone, which I think, it's ironic. It was a way of turning heteronormative culture on its head, and really making that the community's own. But problem with that is that even in heteronormative culture, there was no black and brown faces, so there was no room for that. So unless you fit into a fetishized version of what a black and brown person is, there was no room for that either. That was the first thing I noticed. I came from Southern California, and I was aghast, actually. I mean, and this is saying a lot coming from Southern California, how racist the Castro was. And it was very insidious, because it wasn't outwardly racist necessarily, but it was just, it was either backbiting comments. I didn't go to the Pendulum for the longest time, because they were like, people told me it was like this sleazy bar, which I didn't realize was shorthand for it's a black bar, And so it took me a long time to go to a place that ended up being one of my favorite places, And then it took, part of the reason why it took such a long time was because when I did find out it was a black bar, it was from white guys that were chasing black and brown guys. So I was like, oh, is this like a fetish pickup bar? Because I don't want to go to that either, So it's so layered, and that was one of the first things I encountered was like, where are you from? And I was like, LA. And they're like, no, where are you really from? I'm like, LA. And they're like, no, where are your parents from? LA. So it's just like, it's very...
This is a question for, go ahead. Sorry, Africa?
Well, no, to piggyback on that, what he was saying, it's like, it's hysterical when you say, where are you from? It's like, I'm from the planet Earth is where I'm from, and I'm from San Francisco. It's like, where are your people from? And then I can't tell you, growing up here in the city, and because the thing about the city, I love the city. I mean, I'm a native San Franciscan, so I have a special little spot here. I went to high school here in the city. I went to Washington High School. Go Eagles. And at my school, we were 60% Asian, 22% Black, and everything else was the other. Isn't that nice that white folks at that moment were the other? So I went to a school where white folks were the other. Even though I wasn't the majority, I wasn't truly the final minority. So, but you get into the gifted program classes, and I faced that racism too. And what Eric said about Asians aligning with white folks and getting into white alignment, I transferred out. I was going to Washington. That was out of district for me. I was supposed to go to Lincoln. I was like, no, thank you. I'm going to go to Wash, because at that time Wash was awesome. And so I went to Wash, and my Asian counselor said to me, well, I'm not sure if you're suited for the gifted program here. I'm like, I'm in gifted programs at my junior high. Why wouldn't I be in gifted programs at my high school? Well, we'll see. Let's put you in regular classes first. And so the whole milieu of the prejudice and racism in San Francisco / Castro, it's broad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're starting to get some questions in from our audience. Thank you so much. And keep sending them in, and we'll get them to the panelists. So I'll take a quick break from my questions and ask the panelists, to whomever. I think this is open. So if you'd like to take the question, go ahead and jump in. a question from the audience. I'd like to know what we can do as community members, as neighbors, and as visitors to transform the Castro into a neighborhood that lives up to its inclusive reputation.
I talked about this earlier about, when we see acts of microaggression or overt racism, we have to call it out. Our community have shrunk in its diversity. San Francisco as a whole, but also the Castro specifically. So I think we can't have change without starting the conversation and addressing what's happening. And I think oftentimes my white queer friends don't want to get involved because they think that racism is a race issue that people of color have to deal with. No, it's an issue that white people have to deal with. And unless we're able to bravely and honestly address how we've manifested in our queer communities, we're not going to get over it.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it took me, and this is something, and it's particular to working. I've worked as on and off in bars for 20 years, and especially it's a whole nother kettle of fish. But the queer bar industry is rife with abuse. But the one of the things about being, so even as an employee in these situations, you're at will, you don't have any rights, there's no unions, nothing like this. But then as an employee of color, you really don't want to make waves. And so it took me a long time to start speaking up for me, because pretty much every bar that I have ever worked in, there was a problem, at some point. And not necessarily from ownership, but between, or patrons or fellow employees. And that was something I noticed about people of color that were queer in the Castro, is that, sometimes they didn't want to say anything because they didn't, they risked physical harm or being fired or something like that along those lines. And so we have to stand up and call things for what they are, and it's extremely difficult, and the onus this responsibility should not rest squarely on the shoulders of people of color, on Black folks. It should be on our white allies, right, this is where we need them to step up.
Yeah, I want to add to this question. It was, actually part of my question, but I think we should talk about, equity, racial equity and inequity. And I mean, when we talk about the history, right, the Black, Indigenous, people of color, transgender community were not residents or official residents of the Castro. In fact, they occupied neighborhoods like Polk Street, the Tenderloin. And so when we talk about how do we want the Castro to be much more inclusive, I don't know. I think we need to openly talk about the fact that, well, if the Castro were shutting the people out in the first place, I mean, there's a whole lot of work that we need to do in order to keep, people of color, people a part of our movement, people who are leaders of our movement in the spaces that we claim are LGBTQ inclusive. So what I mean by that is, if people of color, Black, Indigenous, queers, can't be owners of property in the Castro, can't be homeowners, can't be residents of the neighborhood, I'm not sure how inclusive we actually could be, in a neighborhood like the Castro. So I'd love to hear from others who'd like to jump in on that point.
Michelle, in the little over 30 years that I've lived in San Francisco, came up from Southern California and live in San Francisco. I came to San Francisco in 91, end of 91. And at that time, we were in a particular wave of HIV/AIDS crises. And so I think that that's another element in terms of talking about the history of the Castro, the history of our movement, the history of our people, that we don't want to overlook or underestimate. in terms of its impact, in terms of how community was defined, and who was part of community. And I think that in that particular point in time, what I witnessed at the time, and certainly coming into the community a little, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and had my own idealized versions of what this gay community meant and what it, was to be. That was a very difficult time. But what I did see moving forward over 30 years, the majority of my time in San Francisco, I have lived in the Castro. So I've been a long time resident of the Castro. I used to live at 16th between Market and Castro. So I saw you, Eric. I remember you were there. So I was right around the corner from Twin Peaks. I was right, like, deep in the heart of the Castro. And so I've been a long time resident, a member of the community. But I think that over the years, in terms of how we move forward, there have been lessons learned. Again, it is, it is a story that is still unfolding. But there are many things about the history or the Castro that certainly we would hope that beyond the symbolism of diversity, if you look at the base of, for instance, the rainbow flag, I was part of the history of one of the first pairs of hands that hoisted the very first, that massive rainbow flag in '97. And if you look at the base, you'll see that it also commemorates those of us that were appointed or elected at that point in time. And there's quite a diverse group of us, of LGBTQ people. If you go along the sidewalks of Castro, we have the Rainbow Walk, and there's a diversity of folk throughout, not just San Francisco history, but through the whole pantheon of LGBTQ leaders and authors and literary figures and so on that litter or are placed along the sidewalk. So there are many elements about the Castro, even starting with the rainbow flag, that denote a value about inclusion and diversity. But what is being expressed here is that the idea of the Castro as a diverse and inclusive place don't match up with often what people are experiencing. And I think that we have to always be open to how we define and claim space within the Castro, okay? We're investors too. We may not necessarily always be, as people of color, the homeowners or the shop owners or owners of restaurants, bars, etc. But our dollars and our presence is what makes real and what defines those values that are encased and enshrined, whether it's in the rainbow flag or these other monuments that are meant to denote, commemorate, and celebrate the idea of diversity. Yeah. So to a large degree, we can't have it both ways. We either walk the talk, right? Walk the walk, or we're not. And I think that the challenges moving ahead are even a bit more stringent. As the economy, we're in a pandemic. We don't know what the effects of this particular pandemic will be for some time to come. There's homelessness. There's a host of other challenges to the community and what it means. So we have to define what does it take to move forward? How can we create a more inclusive environment and have it be real? And I'll say this one last thing. I always go back to, even with Harvey Milk. Now, Harvey Milk was, I think, if I add up all of our ages, it was even a little bit before my time. Okay, I'll be the elder on the panel today. It was even a little bit beyond my time. But if you look at what Harvey Milk understood at that time, even politically, hey, look, we're not going to have political power. So the Castro was also a political power center, right? It is a political power center that is defined not so much just within a physical space, but the idea of this community being by and large LGBTQ representative. So a lot of San Francisco's or the LGBT community's political power resides within the idea of what the Castro is. It resides within the idea and the legacy of what Harvey Milk was about. And Harvey Milk understood at that time, hey, look, we're in at that time it was district elections, and then we moved to open elections, and then we're back to district elections. But he understood that in order for us to have real political capital, real influence, we can't do it on our own. It can't be just a group of, of corporate white guys that come here over the weekend for a playground, or even folks that are, invested as homeowners and shopkeepers. Yeah. We've got to reach out. We've got to build alliances. We've got to build coalition with other communities. That means Black folks. That means Latin folks. That means the Asian folks. That means all other folks. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we've got to also really hold on to that. And it has to mean something more than just sort of building those coalitions for political power and representation, but it has to mean something in terms of how we see ourselves as persons that are into intersections of life. None of us is just simply and singularly lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, etc. We are Black folks. That's why we're on this panel. We're Black folks, we're Asian folks, we're Latin folks, we're all kinds of folk, right? So that really, by and large, is the majority experience of the LGBT community. It has to be. And so how we take that and claim that space in a definitive way. Don't let anyone else say that, well, this is really, you're just here as visitors. No, I'm not here as a visitor. One thing that does speak that is the most intersectional is the color green, and that's money. And so
hold on, say that one more time for the people in the back.
The one thing, honey, I will say it again, everybody within the sound of my voice, that we have to understand, it doesn't all come down to that, but the one most intersectional color is that of green. And that our dollars are the dollars that are keeping businesses going, whether we're there as visitors, whether we are there as residents, whether we are there, whatever our business is within, again, the idea of the Castro, whether it's along that commercial strip or whether it's in the greater community, So I think that how we really work to redefine and really just claim that space. It doesn't have to be adversarial. It doesn't have to mean that we're coming in as a militia or a takeover. We're just making sure that we're all living up to the values that the idea of the Castro
absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Africa, I think you have a lot to say. I mean, beautiful, right? Thank you so much, Andrea. That was so great. And,
that was
to
fabulous.
Piggyback off of that, right? The redefining and claiming our space. I mean, just recently, there was an organized protest in solidarity, against police violence and the George Floyd killing. And so Africa, take it away and talk about how powerful, that moment was for us to be in the culture.
It was amazing because that was June the 4th, a Friday. We got together a group of people, Tommy Trujillo and C. Freeman, two guys in the Castro who promote different things. And Tommy's a bartender at Bo. And they said, I want to do something. Tommy was like, I'm passionate. We've got to do something. So they reached out to me and said, hey, Africa, will you help us put together a panel? Will you help us get speakers and some entertainment? I said, we're going to do more than just that. So we got all these wonderful drag performers, burlesque performers, but everybody was Black. And it was the best part because we said, because people all of a sudden forget that we're tokenized so much. When it comes to performers and people of color in the Castro. You got here's your one dancing girl, here's your one comedy girl, here's your one Black girl, here's your one Latin girl. The Asian girl, she gets every fourth time because they don't even think about the Asian girl. She's like, oh, we might get her in, whatever her name is, Mei Ling. And it's like rude. And they say shit like that. And you're like, oops, stuff like that. Pardon me, Commonwealth Club. They say stuff like that, and you're like, really? Mei Ling? Yeah. Okay, wow. Okay, really? So, and I mean, I'm bringing it to the real. So bringing all those wonderful people together to, one, show our pain, because that was like, we were all in pain. Black folks and everyone else finally around the world who said to themselves, y'all are not lying. We said, really? It took a filming of 8 minutes and 47 seconds for this man to die in front of you to realize that we were not lying. We are not lying. So having that moment and bringing those artists together and telling our stories, but also telling our truth and performing in our angst, because we didn't want it just to be negative. We wanted it to be like, you know what, this is not a moment, it's a movement. And it's not okay to be just non-racist. You need to be anti-racist and actively anti-racist. And you have to get on board and get on the boat. And that's why we were so successful, I think, with that one. And then that parlayed into what I'm on now, which is the Bay Area Queer Nightlife Coalition, which just had a wonderful Zoom, much like we're doing right now, meeting out. And we did a survey, we did some real data analysis. So, and it's the work that's being done. And we kind of piggybacked off of what someone in Chicago did. And by the way, join me on Sunday. Join me on Saturday. I'm plugging for Oaklash. We're talking about anti-racism in drag community. So join that and you'll hear more about that. Anyway, back to mine. Quick plug. So we got together and we did the data analysis and we went down the line. And like Stephen said earlier, it's hard being a person of color working in a bar and trying not to say the things you need to say to your bosses, let alone to the customers who say the nastiest microaggressions. I know Stephen's like, ooh, baby, you're so pretty for a Latin guy. I'm like, ooh, Eric, you're so cute for an Asian guy. It's like, or my favorite, because Eric's ethnic background and the way you pronounce his name is because people, so they're like, what are you? What are you? What are you? Really? Yeah. More like, can you tell me a little bit about your ethnic background? I think your name is interesting, and how do you pronounce it would be a better way to say instead of who are you or what are you? I mean, Michelle, I know you've many times had them say, so where are your parents from? And you said, and I don't know where your parents are from, Michelle, but I know Asian people get this. Black people, we don't get where you're from. We get more like, why are you here? Latin people and Asian people get where are you from or what are you?
Yes.
Black people, they know what we are. We're former slaves, but we don't want to talk about that. So let someone else take it on, because honey, I could talk for the rest of the hour.
I wanted to. Oh no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Eric.
Okay. So I was working in hospitality during this pandemic. We've seen the hospitality industry as we know it now gone. I think there's a real opportunity now. Right now, we see a lot of people who worked in restaurants now having pop-ups and finding ways to have a voice in the industry that we didn't have before, because the razor thin margins, how much it costs to open a bar or restaurant in the city have grown exponentially. Now we have a lot of people who work in the kitchen, behind the bar, now finding ways to be creative and to build community. I think after the pandemic's over, we have to ask ourselves, do we want these voices in the industry? And we do, because it enriches our lives. It brings America, and the Castro is not made up by just politics, it's about our lived experiences. And going to a restaurant where we learn and get to experience someone's viewpoint, creativity, and culture is what makes this city vibrant and what makes it San Francisco. So I think there is a real opportunity moving forward for, city legislation to find, commercial landlords for leaving storefronts open, or more co-ops or worker-owned businesses, where people who work in the businesses become owners and have a say on how businesses run. I think there's real opportunity in that after this.
Yep.
I wanted just quick. I think that was exactly almost what I was going to say, was that this is a huge this pandemic, for all of its horrible aspects, the one positive takeaway is that we have an opportunity to change the course, at least in the Castro, in our community, the course of the way things have been, you know. And I want to recognize Africa, because the Bay Area Queer Nightlife Coalition, that laid bare some of the worst, and that was only like 4 bars or something that they, and so
Right.
I mean, there's more, I assure you. And this, and going off of what Andrea and Eric were saying, is, you know, like, this is where, in order for these places, and they should survive, you know, like some of these institutions, these are part of our history, but if they want to be part of our future, then they need to change. And this is, and what the Bay Area Queer Nightlife Coalition did is they started that conversation, and we have the power now to change the direction of the way this has all been.
Absolutely.
I was hoping that we end on this, you know, positive note. So I'm going to come back on, you know, where we go from here and COVID and how that impacts what our plan might be. But I want to go back to our audience questions. We got about 15 minutes left. And so make my promises good here that we'll get the questions to our panelists. There's a question from the audience. How about Native Americans? What are their experiences in the Castro?
I would say the Native American experience is almost non-existent. I feel like the last time that San Francisco really talked about Native American experiences when we had the occupation of Alcatraz back in the 70s. Mm. And so if you are younger than knowing that history, then you don't really see the Native American. And of talking about, yes, Black folks, we were stolen and enslaved, but Native Americans' land, culture, lives were snuffed out. Genocide. So I would say Native Americans do not have a visibility as much as they can, and I think that it's turning. There are people who work at Strut. There are Indigenous performers in both the voguing and queer nightlife scene who are really, really proud of their Indigenous roots, and they've been speaking out and coming forward more. I think we need to continuously amplify Indigenous. We know that Black and Indigenous folks are in the hardest lane, and that's followed right behind with Latin and Asian folks. So the lanes are hard. I mean, as you get towards, and colorism takes you towards the white adjacency, we've got to work on getting our Indigenous brothers and sisters' voices heard more.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. I think that you only have to look to, and this is something that we don't learn in school if you grew up in California, but our California's history with Indigenous people is one of the worst in the United States. And so the peripheral place in both history and our present that the Indigenous peoples of California and all over the United States occupy is only going to be even less in queer culture, unfortunately. And I can actually count on my hands the amount of times I've met queer Indigenous folks that are even like from California, you know, in the Castro, you know, like yeah.
Here's a question, and for just looking at time, I want to be able to get through the questions, and so we'll take a comment or two from the panelists and move on to another question from the audience. Not to center white folks in this conversation, but I'm curious about what white allies are doing to fight racism so that Black, Indigenous, people of color don't have to do all the work. Andrea, I think we are muted.
Andrea, unmute.
Oh, I am unleashed and unmuted. It said just in the Castro or on all the United States. You know, we're in a very, I'll go back to what Stephen was saying. I absolutely agree. I think we all do. We're in a particular place in time. It's a very pivotal moment in terms of how we're going to move forward, I don't know that we'll get to a post-COVID-19 period anytime soon, but we're in a time of real uprising. And we have some real critical choices to make in terms of where we're going to go as a nation. Are we going to move forward with the idea of a democracy, or do we move forward under the current regime that seems to be about authoritarian, autocratic? That's my opinion. But I think that we can see what's happening on the streets, and it ain't good. But people are stepping up, right? People are stepping up, and that are forming those coalitions and those alliances where everyone, it should not be just on people of color. It should not just be on Black folks to talk about police brutality every week when someone else is slain. It should not just be on Latin folks and Asian folks to talk about the anti-immigrant, the anti-Asian hatred that is going on right now. We all have to be involved in the conversation. So I do think, I am excited and interested in what's going on in terms of how white allies or white folks are looking at sort of how to be anti-racist. I don't think it's incumbent upon me to teach you how to be anti-racist or whatnot. You've had 400, 500 years to get it together. And, but it doesn't mean that we're not allies and we don't work together. I appreciate anyone that wants to be a part of that part of the American experience moving forward. Yes. But there's, I think, developing language in terms of, it's not just about being not racist. It's about being anti-racist, and what does that mean? So that's one thing I'll say about that. And I just want to say one other thing. I think that what's also very important, even going back to the issue of how Indigenous people are represented in the Castro or not represented in the Castro, two-spirited people. I think that I would like to acknowledge, I think that over time that there have been two-spirited people that have been leaders or have had voice in the community, and they still are. They're still there, but could there be more of that voice, more of that presence? Absolutely. But let's not forget one other thing. In California, if we are nearly a majority minority state, which seems to be the greatest fear of other areas in this country, and that's why we're in the situation that we're in right now, it's the fear of the majority minority, right? And if we, as people of color here in California, are really the majority experience, that would mean that the majority experience, more than likely, of LGBTQ identified people are people of color. So the positioning of the conversation in terms of racism, whether it's in the Castro, it has to be oriented towards the idea that really we do represent the majority experience, and we're close to that. So we're not coming to the table without some agency and without some representation, and we're not ancillary, we're not tertiary, we should not be an afterthought. Our experiences should be considered more and more as a majority experience. So if the Castro or other communities are to survive as center points for LGBT inclusion, movement, and support, we have to really orientate ourselves toward that recognition of fact. And also there's other places. It's not just the Castro. Look at what's happening in Oakland and what folks are doing there to really develop and build a stronger LGBT center point for the Bay Area and San Jose, et cetera. But nonetheless, as a majority minority in the state of California alone, we have greater agency.
Thank you.
Also, white allies should look at their lives on both the micro and the macro level. What are things that they do or things that they put up with on a micro level that perpetuates systemic racism, that perpetuates prejudice against people of color? And then on the macro level, what are they doing with their dollars? What are they doing with their votes? What are they doing with their amplified voices and platforms? There's both of those places and communities need to be addressed on their part in order for us to really have honest and open dialogue, not just with white people with themselves, but with all of us together.
Right on.
There are a couple, maybe we'll take one more question from the audience. And thank you so much, all of you who wrote to us and asked questions and comments. And thank you to a couple comments for me in noting the POC community in Eureka Valley. The last question we'll take from the audience. What can nonprofits do in this conversation? How can they play in this space? What role can they play?
I think that in my experience, the nonprofit sector should be commended oftentimes for having conversations that you won't find in the corporate sector. I'll say that much. But anyone that's worked in the nonprofit sector also knows that the majority of the power that's held in that sector is by cis white men, well-meaning cis white men, but regardless. And so, even institutions that work for the advocacy of equity, I sat on the board of the Harvey Milk Democratic Club for 8 years, and all of our legislation and things that we were trying to pass were for equity, for to bring POC and Black voices to the center. But one thing that we struggled with as a organization, still do, and I will say are actively trying to change, is integrating that representation into our membership. It's like we can't move forward if the people aren't there. We can't. We then fall back into the same dynamic.
I think that one of the things with the nonprofit, and I appreciate your leadership and your experience with the Harvey Milk Democratic Club, but that is a democratic club. And right. in terms of nonprofit organizations, nonprofit is such a broad, there are all types of nonprofits, but I do think that certainly one of the things that is important, building on what Stephen was saying, is in terms of the leadership of nonprofits, that how do we mobilize and how do we build pipelines of people of color that I think there are plenty of people of color that are LGBT that are ready and prepared to lead, to be executives of nonprofits and sit on boards, etc. But I think that sometimes too, the idea of certain nonprofits is that we are always the subject. We are always the target population to be served. And I think that has a little bit of an impact. And not to say that we are not, that there aren't realities in terms of folks of color that need the services and should access the services that some of the direct service nonprofits provide. But in terms of even advocacy organizations, that I think that there are some great nonprofit organizations that we can all, the National Center for Lesbian Rights is by far one of my favorites. I think that I've worked, out in equal workplace advocates and working with corporate entities on inclusion and diversity of LGBTQ people. So there are a lot of nonprofits. That's a whole other economy within our movement. So some are doing, I think, better than others, but I do think that there are a number of nonprofit organizations that are really beginning to look at what equity means within the organization itself. And how do you create, and how do you support, and how do you tap into the talent pool of folks that are able to not only to serve or be an employee, but also can lead those organizations. People see a little bit more of that moving forward.
Right. Yeah. I love that. We only have a couple minutes left. And talking to all of you and all that you give and contribute to our community is just, I don't have the words for it, but I could cry right now and being grateful for all that you do. It sounds like our community is standing up, coming together. San Francisco Queer Nightlife, is a lifeline for many of us who are still in the city and looking forward to the day in which we can rejoice and come together and dance again. And this time, hopefully much more, maybe an inclusive resurgence of queer people in the city. So we'll look forward to that. Let's leave our audience with one or two things, maybe 30 seconds for each of you, or a minute, one or two things that we could all do to be less complicit in, racist or racial oppression, or complicit in these systems that, are racist. We'll start with Africa.
The number one thing is remember that people make mistakes, call them out on the mistake, and try to have the grace to help them with the mistake. If they don't follow with the grace that you give them, then you do what you need to do. But let's come with some grace. Everybody makes mistakes. It can't just be you're white and you're bad. It's like you're white, you're privileged, and that's the way it is, and that's all it is. So now I need your help to keep helping all of us move together. Period.
Thank you. Eric.
Yeah, I think for queer POC in our community, we have to really understand our intersectionalities and accept it, or truths with conviction. I think together as people of color, by understanding that, we can then reach out to our white allies, so then they can also hear and learn about our intersectionality. I don't think that talking about race on its own is gonna solve or move the barometer forward. I think we have to understand that race, sexism, gender, socioeconomic status, those are all aligned, and racism is not racism on its own, And so understanding intersectionality as a way to heal, empower, and amplify marginalized voices and experiences within the queer experience is very, very important.
Thank you. Stephen.
Yeah, I can't do much than build on what they both just said. Is, it's like, I guess the complicity on the part of white folks, that would boil down to what Eric had said earlier about micro and macro. I see so many posts on social media and stuff say, like, I know it's bad, but I just had to get Chick-fil-A. I'm like, what? It's like, think about what you're enabling when you do just buying food, and then, like, amongst our community, I think, there's so many demands that are made on us already. I would just say, trust in the strength of your beauty and the strength of our community, and don't play into the rules that were handed to us. The intersectionality is the key. This is how we have strength in numbers here. We don't have to be divided. We can be united. We have to recognize the beauty of not just ourselves, but the other people that are being oppressed. And I think that that's very, especially in the queer community, that's very important to remember, because so often, members of our community are completely forgotten or taken out of the conversation, like in our trans community, so we have to remember, especially Black and POC in the trans community. So it's just, that's what I would say, is just, recognize our beauty and our strength and our power to be united.
And Andrew, you have the last word, the last answer, and keep it to a minute or less.
Absolutely. Well, I think in order for us all to move forward, we have choices. And the choices, do we move forward together? And that's really the only way to move forward, is to do so together. But understanding and embracing our history, some of the greatest thinkers, the greatest activists, the greatest leaders on the ideas of what we now call intersectionality, and ideas of how do we move past homophobia, how do we move past racism, sexism, have been LGBTQ people, have been queer leaders. I represent also the Bayard Rustin LGBT Coalition for Civil Rights. We are the holders, we are the bearers of his legacy. This, as we just celebrated a week ago, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, in August 1963, August of 28th. It was Bayard Rustin who was the architect, who was the leader, the main organizer of that march, where Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. Starting with Bayard Rustin and understanding what his philosophies were in terms of how do you build coalition and bring us together and move past the ills of racism and sexism and homophobia. He was a proud, openly gay white man, gay black man. Audre Lorde, Alice Walker, Bell Hooks. We have such a wealth of thinkers that are there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but know our history and continue to stand on that as often the person's out front on these issues. And so I just ask people to also embrace that. We have choices right now and how we're going to move forward together, how we're going to look both ways before we cross the street and then hold hands together to get across safely. And as Africa said, there has to be grace and there has to be those moments. But the train is pulling out of the station, and hopefully we'll have a train where there's love and kindness and respect, dignity, and certainly an eye towards a future that is not about race.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, our community heroes, Stephen, Andrea, Eric, Africa. Thank you to San Francisco Pride, Commonwealth Club, Comcast, Gilead for supporting this program and helping us put it together. And thank you all for joining us in this conversation, and all those folks who reached out and sent us their questions, and all of you tuned in. Share this. It'll be available. You can check for a full listing of all Commonwealth Club problems. We have a lot of problems. We're going to solve them, especially with the truth. But what I meant to say is all Commonwealth Club programs at commonwealthclub.org/MMS for the Michelle Meow Show program. Next week, we'll have Nikki Solis, San Francisco public defender, who'll be with us here to talk about her time in serving with Kamala Harris, Senator Kamala Harris, who will be our next, or maybe, we'll talk about politics next week. Anyway, thank you all so much. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Be well, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everybody.